A reading from the book of Acts. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone, because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
My iPhone broke this week. I didn't break it, mind you. It broke. It just quit working. Now, this didn't seem fair to me. With all we're going through, feeling cut off in communications with one another during this pandemic, it just didn't seem right. And now this. Of course, I still had my iPad and a Mac and a MacBook Pro. I am an all-Apple guy, don't you know? So I could still iMessage, Facebook message, and I could FaceTime and Zoom. But all of a sudden, there I was feeling naked without a phone. Well, I actually did have a phone, but it's a landline, and I just keep it so that I don't miss any calls from telemarketers. Anyway, I should give you an update on my communications health. My replacement iPhone arrived on Tuesday afternoon, so I'm now fully recovered, thank you. This all got me thinking, though, about how we respond to changes in our world and in our lives, losses in particular. Without a cell phone, I was barely out of communication. I had all these other devices, but I was tempted at first to dwell upon what I could not do rather than what I could do. And when my focus shifted to what I still could do, I began to realize that this devastating deprivation I was experiencing actually opened up other things to me to do, like writing handwritten notes. Remember those? Or sitting on the back porch and eavesdropping on the conversation birds were having with each other, or giving my full and undivided attention to Kim. Yeah, let's not go there. Across these past weeks, I have been talking to my Christian, Jewish, and Muslim friends about how we adapt our spiritual and religious life in our communities. And we've shared stories about how each of our faiths have, at times of crisis, reinvented themselves. The key is to focus on what's left, not what's lost. In the years following the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, Jewish life was altogether reinvented. It had been a combination of temple worship and synagogue worship. The temple was home base for all the great festivals like Passover and Yom Kippur and others. But with the temple gone, the rabbis asked themselves, how would they maintain their community without a building? How would they maintain their duty to God? And so while wandering in the region of the Holy Land not far from where Jesus was born, they reconstituted Jewish life around prayer, study, and acts of loving kindness. These three. The loss of the temple was traumatic and disorienting, but soon they began to find their spiritual footing again. It wasn't as easy as simply saying, no temple, no problem, but they were able to go back to their roots and remember that they were the people of God before they had a building they could call the house of God. We are in that time again now. Only our challenge, honestly, is far easier than theirs. And when we consider the passage from Acts 2 that we read today, you can see that the Spirit of God was innovating from the very beginning of the church. The early church had no building. They had no sign out in front of a house even that said First Baptist Church of Jerusalem or Antioch Baptist Church. They had the apostles. They had the Hebrew Scriptures. They had food and possessions. They had the Spirit of Christ within them and among them, and they had each other. Which is to say, church, they had church. Some of you may have seen the opinion piece that Rabbi David Stern and I authored this week in the Dallas Morning News. In the print edition, there was a photo of church doors with a sign hanging on the doors that said, "Closed." We know what they meant, but the truth is, we have never closed the church. Even during COVID-19, in this lockdown time, only the building is closed. So if we're open and reinventing ourselves during this time, we might learn from the early church some things about how to do church, about what we still can do. First, the early church devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Now, we don't have the apostles still among us. Or do we? We have their teaching in the Christian Scriptures. And when we gather together for Sunday school, even if it's by Zoom or Facebook Live, we are attending to their teaching. Studying Scripture together is part of the ongoing formation of the people of God. And when we do it, we're not just sharing our contemporary opinions about what's going on. We are actually listening to our ancestors in the faith and giving them priority in our contemplations. The apostles and the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures before them were closest to the mighty acts of God that took place at the birth of our faith. So we don't dismiss them just because they are dead. We give their voices a hearing. Their witness lives on. We can still do that. The breaking of bread, then, is probably a reference to Holy Communion. Don't neglect the sharing together at the Lord's table. We are doing that too. It's not the way we want to, but we are finding ways. And in just a few moments, we will gather in our homes together on this Sunday morning, and we will share together at the Lord's table, trusting that the Spirit of God will be remembering us, bringing us together spiritually, even if we cannot gather physically. They also shared meals together in their homes. So the Lord's Supper, but also regular meals. And they did it with glad and generous hearts. That is, they were grateful to God for what they had, focusing on what they had, not on what they lacked. And they were generous with each other, making sure everyone had a place at the table and everyone had something to eat. We can still do that. And we are still attending to our prayers. Now, partly in this case, it's a reference to worship. We don't have the temple, but neither did the early church after a time. They had to gather in homes to worship and pray. And imagine that. They had to gather in homes to worship and pray. But here we are. We can still do that. Attending to our prayers is also a way of saying that we share in concerns about our lives and things happening with one another. I'm on the email list for several Sunday school departments in our church, and I will tell you, you are doing an incredible job of keeping up with one another. bearing each other's burdens, offering those to God in prayer. We can still do that. And then there's generosity. Wow, did you hear in this text what they did back then? All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. The church back then depended upon one another. They had no notion of individualism in their Christian lives. They were a community. They belonged together. And I'm seeing that in you right now. My goodness, you are giving and giving and giving. And your gifts are helping those who are unable themselves to give right now because of their need. Some are experiencing more peril in their financial lives and in their employment during this terrible period. The same is true for the way we are helping our hungry and needy neighbors outside the church. We are not hoarding our possessions, we are sharing them. So far, in the Can You Spare a Can campaign that we've conducted here at Wilshire and in our neighborhoods, 26 drop-off sites, we have collected and delivered to the Wilkinson Center more than 2,500 pounds of food, and another $3,000 worth of food on top of that has been delivered in an order we made with Cisco Foods. Well done, church. Robert Walensky wrote in the Morning News this week about how people have been giving across Dallas during this crisis time, and he noted that normally in Dallas the way this works is wealthy philanthropists give really large sums of money and end up with their names on buildings and the like. But the wonderful folks at the Communities Foundation of Texas understand that this is a different time. And they have been calling on even the wealthiest to give differently and to help those in need. If you have a heart for anybody, give them money, Wendy Burton said. She is CFT's Senior Director of Community Philanthropy. Even small amounts make a huge difference right now. And she means that not just for the wealthiest people. The same is being said by Matthew Randazzo, President and CEO of the Dallas Foundation. He said, philanthropy is the joy of giving and helping others. Everyone who can make the rent and a car payment can be a philanthropist today with as little as $25. And that's the message we must amplify. Right. And doesn't that sound just like the early church? And doesn't that sound just like our church? We can still do that. My mother-in-law is still grieving the loss of her husband, Bill O'Brien. We all are here. He was dear to us in our church. He was one of the most generous souls I knew. So this past week, we bought her a CD player. Remember those? So that she could play the songs that he sang on one of his old musical collections. Well, after a day of listening to his music, she came in to us and said, is there something I can do, something I can give to honor Bill's memory at Wilshire? Well, we got right on that, and we're going to fix up the mission visioning room and name it for Bill O'Brien. But the bigger point is this. When we allow ourselves to be inspired by the apostles, by the saints of the church across time, it leads us to do amazing and generous things. Things that, just like in the early church, will end with our having the goodwill of all people, and maybe even more being added to our number who are being saved. Yes, we can still do that. And we are. Let's just keep being the church. Church. Amen.